The year was 1842. Louisiana's plantation country shimmered under a sun that gave beauty even to cruelty. Vast fields of sugarcane stretched endlessly along the Mississippi River, their sweetness born from human misery. To the untrained eye, Willow Creek Plantation looked like a paradise, a grand Greek revival mansion framed by oak trees heavy with Spanish moss, white columns gleaming like ivory against the southern sky. But behind those columns, the air smelled of sweat, blood, and molasses. This was a world where luxury floated on suffering, where every crystal chandelier, every silver spoon, every delicate piano note was paid for by hands that would never touch freedom. The master of this empire was Jonathan Harrington, a man who believed refinement excused cruelty. To his peers, he was the very picture of Southern nobility, educated, disciplined, and fiercely proud of the fortune he'd inherited and expanded. Yet his charm concealed a temper known across St. James Parish. He was a man who expected perfection, from his crops, his family, and his slaves. His wife, Margaret Harrington, seemed carved from a different world entirely. Educated in Charleston, trained in music and manners, she had brought to Louisiana not just her beauty, but a passion for European art and melody. To her, the plantation's parlor wasn't just a room, it was a stage. And every evening, under candlelight, she filled it with music, a fragile escape from the world outside. But the music that would one day change their lives had not yet been written. At this time, Willow Creek was alive with contradiction. The laughter of guests during extravagant dinners mingled with the distant crack of the overseer's whip. The same house that hosted grand soirees by night ran on human endurance by day. It was a system built on control and silence. Every word, every glance from those enslaved, was measured. Among the 173 enslaved people who labored here was one man who stood slightly apart. Not because he was free, but because he could create. His name was Isaiah Miller. He wasn't born in Louisiana, but had been brought here from Virginia years earlier, sold for twice the price of other men his age because of a single line on his bill of sale. Negro man, about 25, sound of body and mind, skilled upon the violin. To Jonathan Harrington, that meant prestige. To Margaret, it meant wonder. But to Isaiah, it meant survival. Music was the only voice he had left in a world that refused to hear him speak. When Isaiah played, something shifted in the air. The plantation's brutality seemed to recede, just for a moment. Margaret once wrote in her diary, "There is something in his playing that feels almost divine, unsettling even. How can someone considered property create beauty so free?" That quiet question would haunt her and destroy her world. Because in that question lay the seed of rebellion. Not loud, not violent, but melodic. As seasons passed, the plantation grew richer, its master more arrogant, and its enslaved population more desperate. Yet within the cracked walls of a music room, under the polished surface of civility, something was tuning itself to a frequency of truth. A bow drawing across strings. A melody whispered against power. A man rehearsing, unknowingly, for the night he would play history's most haunting note. And so, before the symphony began, there was silence. A silence heavy with everything unsaid, waiting for a single man and his violin to break it forever. The first time Isaiah Miller was seen at Willow Creek Plantation, he wasn't carrying a shovel. He was carrying a violin case. It was an unusual sight, an enslaved man brought not for labor of the fields, but for the labor of beauty. Jonathan Harrington had paid dearly for him, bragging that even in New Orleans, no one could match the sound of his Negro violinist. To the planter class, Isaiah was an ornament, proof that even refinement could be owned. But Isaiah's story didn't begin there. He'd been born on a plantation in Virginia, around 1810. His earliest memories weren't of whips or overseers, but of a sound, the way his master's son drew a bow across strings in a bright parlor upstairs. That boy, unlike most, saw more curiosity than color. He'd handed the instrument to Isaiah once, half in jest. The boy's small hands trembled, but when he played, even the mocking laughter stopped. It was clumsy, but real. Music had found him. Years later, when his master fell into debt and began selling off his slaves, Isaiah's musical gift became his curse. He fetched nearly double the price of others, his talent recorded like livestock quality, plays the violin exceedingly well. And so, in 1834, he was sent downriver, another commodity packed among sugarcane tools and furniture. His destination, Willow Creek. From the moment Margaret Harrington heard him play, her fascination was immediate. He wasn't just a musician, he was something she couldn't explain. His fingers found the soul in every note of Mozart and Beethoven, but what unsettled her most wasn't his skill. It was his emotion. His music didn't sound learned, it sounded remembered. She began to bring him into the mansion more often, away from the fields, asking him to perform for her guests, her children, and most often for herself. She would sit by the piano, eyes closed, while Isaiah's bow carved invisible grief into the air. For brief moments, she almost forgot he was a slave. And for brief moments, so did he. But Jonathan Harrington didn't forget. To him, Isaiah was a possession, and his wife's admiration a dangerous indulgence. Yet even Jonathan couldn't resist the praise of visitors, all marveling at the slave who played like a European virtuoso. It made the master look cultured. So Isaiah stayed, suspended between two worlds, adored for his art, despised for his existence. Still, that violin became both his freedom and his chain. When he played, he could travel beyond the plantation, beyond the whip and the ledger. But when the bow dropped and the silence returned, so did the walls, the orders, the reminders that his music existed for others, not for himself. He learned to smile when praised, bow when commanded, and disappear when finished. Yet every performance left a piece of him behind, a fragment of something too human for the world he was trapped in. The plantation staff began whispering about him, not out of jealousy, but awe. They said the violin could make the mistress cry, could make even the master pause mid-sentence. That it could bring peace for a moment, and fear the next. Isaiah said little. But sometimes, when alone, he'd whisper a tune not written by Mozart or Bach, but by memory, rhythms that didn't belong to Europe. Rhythms that belonged to something older, darker, freer. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the obedience and the silence, the first spark of defiance began to hum, faint but steady, like a string tightening in preparation for a performance that would one day make the world stop listening and start hearing. The music room at Willow Creek was the only place on the plantation where silence felt sacred. Sunlight spilled through tall French windows, glinting off polished instruments and stacks of imported sheet music. It was Margaret Harrington's sanctuary, a room meant for elegance and escape. But over time, it became something far more dangerous, the quiet stage of an impossible connection. Isaiah stood near the piano most afternoons, bow in hand, waiting for the mistress's signal. She would hum softly before they began, her fingers drifting across the keys like raindrops, then nod for him to join. When the first note left his violin, the room transformed. Here, he was not a slave. Not for a few precious minutes. His sound filled the walls, touched the curtains, wrapped around her voice like silk. Margaret often found herself forgetting to breathe. His music was different. Not just disciplined but alive, as though he was playing from somewhere far deeper than any conservatory could teach. Sometimes she'd catch his expression, calm, almost serene, and yet behind it, a quiet sorrow that broke her composure. She began to write about it in her diary. There is something unsettling in his playing. Beauty so pure that it reveals the ugliness around it. And there was ugliness, plenty of it. Beyond the mansion walls, the fields roared with pain. Overseer William Thornton ruled them with a whip and ledger, his cruelty legendary even among other plantations. Every cry that echoed from the sugarcane fields reached Isaiah's ears, each one finding its way into his music, though no one listening could recognize the screams hidden between the notes. Margaret tried to pretend she didn't see. Yet every time Isaiah played, she heard what she couldn't admit, the humanity her world was built on denying. Their lessons became longer, their silences heavier. Sometimes, when she handed him sheet music, their fingers brushed. Neither spoke, but both knew such moments were forbidden. Rumors began to stir. House servants noticed the glances, the way Margaret's laughter faded when her husband entered the room, the way Isaiah was summoned more often for private rehearsals. And Jonathan Harrington noticed too. One winter evening in 1841, he returned home earlier than expected from a business trip to New Orleans. The mansion was still, save for the faint sound of a violin from upstairs. Following the music, Jonathan found the door to the music room slightly ajar. Inside, Margaret at the piano, Isaiah standing close, both absorbed in a piece of music she had brought from Charleston. It was an innocent scene, but in the mind of a jealous man, innocence had no place. Jonathan burst through the door, the music snapping to silence. His face burned crimson. He didn't ask questions, he gave orders. "Whip him," he shouted. "Now!" Margaret screamed, pleading that nothing improper had occurred. But Jonathan's pride had already been wounded. His plantation, his reputation, his ownership, all seemed challenged by the sight of a black man standing in his wife's presence, sharing a language that Jonathan himself could not understand, art. That night, the overseer obeyed. Isaiah was taken to the stables, tied, and lashed 50 times. The punishment ledger would later note only, for insolence and impropriety, by master's direct order. It did not record the damage to his hands. The cuts along his wrists and tendons would never fully heal. The very hands that made him valuable, that made him human, had been broken to remind him that he was property. But pain, like music, can transform. As Isaiah lay in the straw that night, blood on his back, fingers trembling, he made a silent vow. They could scar his hands, but they would never own what those hands could create. The nights after the whipping were the longest of Isaiah Miller's life. Every nerve in his back screamed when he moved. His left hand, the hand that gave life to the violin, trembled like a leaf in the wind. When he tried to close his fingers around the bow, they refused to obey. The overseer's punishment hadn't just been cruelty. It was a message. You are not a man. You are a possession. For days, Isaiah lay in silence on the dirt floor of his quarters, staring at his wounded hands. The other enslaved people left food by his side, afraid to speak. They knew the plantation's rules: no sympathy for those who were punished. Even kindness could be punished in return. But in the darkness, something within Isaiah refused to die. Pain had always been part of his life, but never like this, never tied to what made him who he was. His music had been the only thing that was his alone. Now, even that seemed stolen. When Margaret Harrington finally convinced her husband to let Isaiah heal, it wasn't mercy, it was guilt disguised as civility. She couldn't sleep after hearing the sound of the whip that night. She wrote in her diary, "His blood stains the earth beneath my window. I hear the music that might never be played again." So Jonathan allowed it. Isaiah was spared from the fields, permitted to stay near the mansion and recover. But Jonathan made one condition: Isaiah would play only under his direct order, never alone with Margaret again. Weeks turned into months. Isaiah practiced in solitude, long after the mansion lights went out. His fingers were slow, stiff, untrustworthy. He forced them into motion until his palms bled anew, teaching himself to move through the pain. Every wrong note was a wound. Every small success, a rebellion. The other enslaved workers began to notice a change in him. He rarely spoke. He ate little. His expression grew distant, eyes fixed on something far away. The Isaiah they had once known, the man who smiled after a song, who found joy in sound, was gone. In his place stood someone quieter, colder, but sharper. Inside his head, melodies began to form, not the ones his mistress adored, but something darker. Notes that carried anger, memory, and something dangerous. These new rhythms didn't come from Europe or the church. They came from deep inside, from a lineage older than Louisiana itself. One night, a young stable hand named Daniel Lewis overheard him humming in the dark. The tune was strange, unfamiliar yet powerful. Daniel asked what it was. Isaiah answered softly, "Something that isn't for them." Then he smiled, the first time in months. Margaret, meanwhile, watched from a distance. When Isaiah finally played again for her husband's guests, she noticed something had changed. The technique was perfect, the emotion buried. The music had become mechanical, beautiful, but hollow. Yet when she closed her eyes, she swore she could still feel that same power beneath the surface, waiting to break free. Jonathan felt it too. He didn't understand it, but he feared it. He began keeping Isaiah under closer supervision. No unsupervised rehearsals. No late-night practice. No freedom beyond the boundaries of performance. But the thing Jonathan feared most was already beyond his control. Every night, Isaiah returned to the stables to play when the world slept, not for applause, but for vengeance, for remembrance, for himself. The bow moved differently now, slower, deliberate. Each note carried the weight of every lash, every silence, every truth he could never speak aloud. Somewhere in those long, secret hours, a new piece was born. One that would one day echo through the halls of Willow Creek like a ghost returning home. A piece without a name. A song that would end in death. By the spring of 1842, the Louisiana air hung heavy with heat, the kind that made the nights feel endless. At Willow Creek, the grandest celebration in the plantation's history was about to unfold. Jonathan Harrington, proud as ever, had announced a lavish gala to mark his 25th year as master of the estate. It would be a night of splendor, he declared, proof that Willow Creek stood as a beacon of culture and prosperity. To him, it wasn't just a party, it was a performance of power. Carriages arrived all afternoon, rolling up the long dirt drive beneath lanterns strung from the oak trees. Ladies in satin gowns stepped down carefully, their heels sinking into the damp earth. Gentlemen in tailcoats and polished boots bowed to Margaret Harrington, whose practiced smile hid exhaustion and something else. Inside the mansion, servants hurried through marble halls, balancing trays of crystal glasses and silver platters. The scent of roasted quail, sugared fruit, and wine filled the air. The chandeliers burned so brightly they turned night into day. And somewhere upstairs, Isaiah Miller tuned his violin. He hadn't been told what to play, he didn't need to be. The plan had been discussed for weeks, polite waltzes, familiar sonatas, music to please the crowd. But Isaiah had other music inside him, music no one had asked for and no one could silence. He wore a dark jacket that once belonged to Jonathan's father, slightly too big, but the best the plantation could offer. His injured hand ached with every movement, yet his grip on the bow was steady. The old pain had become part of him now, like another string on the instrument. When he stepped into the light of the ballroom, the crowd hushed. 100 faces turned toward him, curious, admiring, but never seeing. To them, he was not a man. He was a marvel. The evening began as expected. He played Vivaldi, then Bach, each note precise, almost mechanical. Margaret sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, heart pounding with memories she couldn't name. Jonathan stood proudly at the front, accepting compliments as if he himself had composed the music. But then, Isaiah paused. He looked out over the crowd, at the master who had scarred his hands, at the mistress who had both pitied and betrayed him, and at the walls that had trapped him for 8 years. Then he lifted the violin again, and began to play something no one recognized. The melody was soft at first, fragile, almost mournful. The guests leaned in, expecting another piece of European beauty. But soon, the rhythm shifted. It wasn't European. It was older. It pulsed with something raw and alive. The air itself seemed to tighten. The music grew bolder, deeper, threads of sorrow twisting into defiance. It was as if he was telling a story, one too dangerous to speak aloud. Margaret's breath caught. She knew instantly this was not part of the program. But she couldn't stop listening. Every note struck like confession, like prayer, like truth. Jonathan's expression hardened. He moved toward the stage. "Enough," he barked. Isaiah did not stop. The bow moved faster, the sound climbing toward something unbearable, grief, rage, liberation, all tangled together. Guests shifted uneasily. Some said later it felt like the music was pressing on their chests. Jonathan reached for Isaiah's arm. In that instant, Isaiah's eyes opened, calm, unflinching, and the violin screamed. Then, silence. Jonathan staggered, hand to his chest, his face drained of color. He fell before anyone understood what had happened. Wine glasses shattered. Someone screamed. And Isaiah kept playing. For a few more haunting seconds, the melody softened, a requiem. Then he lowered the bow, expression unreadable. When the final note faded, the master of Willow Creek was dead. And the slave who had played his death march stood silently beneath the chandelier's trembling light, free for the first time, if only in sound. For a moment, no one breathed. The final note lingered in the air like smoke, and Jonathan Harrington lay motionless on the ballroom floor. The candlelight flickered across his face, pale, lips parted, eyes frozen in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Guests screamed. Chairs overturned. A woman fainted, her pearl necklace snapping as she fell. The overseer, William Thornton, shoved through the crowd. "Doctor!" someone yelled, and Dr. Samuel Wells, a guest that evening, knelt beside the body. He checked for a pulse, then met the horrified gazes around him. "He's gone." The words fell like a gavel. In that instant, all eyes turned toward Isaiah Miller. He stood where he'd been standing all along, violin still in hand, bow lowered, face unreadable. There was no fear, no triumph, only stillness. It was Thomas Harrington, the eldest son, who broke first. "He killed him," he shouted. "The slave, he killed my father." The accusation hung in the air, absurd yet irresistible. Fear is contagious, and that night it spread faster than reason. Thornton and two guests seized Isaiah, wrenching the violin from his grip. "You'll answer for this, boy," the overseer spat, though even he avoided meeting Isaiah's eyes. Margaret stumbled forward, tears streaking her face. "No, no, please, he didn't," her voice cracked. The room, however, was no longer listening. The sheriff was summoned before dawn. By morning, the plantation was a storm of rumor. Some claimed they'd seen Isaiah smile as Jonathan fell. Others swore they felt something unnatural in the music, as though each note was meant to wound. When Sheriff James Beaumont arrived, he found Isaiah locked in a storage room, unchained, silent, his violin lying on the floor beside him. "Do you understand what they're saying?" Beaumont asked. Isaiah looked up slowly. His voice, when it came, was quiet, even. "I played what was already there." The sheriff frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Isaiah said nothing more. The autopsy revealed no poison, no wound, no evidence of violence. The cause of death, cardiac failure. But for men desperate for answers, that wasn't enough. It couldn't be coincidence. Not here, not now, not with music that made a roomful of people tremble. The whispers grew darker. They said Isaiah had learned voodoo music from a Haitian slave who once worked the cane fields. That he had woven curses into his melody. That his bowstring had been dipped in the devil's ink. By the time Isaiah stood before the parish court, he was no longer a man in the public's eyes. He was a myth, something dangerous that needed to be destroyed. The trial lasted only 2 days. Witness after witness described the haunting power of his music and the horror that followed. Dr. Wells himself testified that the intensity of the performance could have strained a weak heart beyond endurance. When asked if he intended to harm his master, Isaiah simply said, "I played his truth back to him." The courtroom fell silent. The judge, baffled but unmoved, declared him guilty. Sentence: death by hanging. Margaret fainted. In the weeks that followed, letters poured in, some demanding his execution, others begging mercy. But through it all, Isaiah remained wordless, waiting. And then, just one day before the rope was to tighten around his neck, a message arrived from the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge. Sentence commuted. Life imprisonment instead of death. No one knew why. Some said Margaret had begged for his life. Others claimed the governor feared turning a man's music into martyrdom. When the news reached Isaiah, he simply nodded. He asked for one thing, his violin. The sheriff refused. "You'll have no more of that devil's sound in this state." Isaiah's only reply was a whisper. "You can silence the strings, but not the song." The St. James Parish Courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Planters, preachers, merchants, and their wives packed the benches until the room sweltered like a furnace. Outside, even more gathered, some out of outrage, others out of morbid curiosity. Everyone had come to witness the trial of the enslaved man said to have killed with music. Isaiah Miller sat at the center of it all, hands bound, eyes steady. His once calloused fingers twitched unconsciously, as if they still longed for a bow that was no longer his. The prosecutor, Henry Garrison, strutted before the jury like a performer himself. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are faced with a deed so unnatural that it shakes the very order of God's creation. This man used his devilish art to strike down his master before 100 witnesses." The crowd murmured, the word devilish carrying more weight than evidence ever could. Garrison called his witnesses, plantation guests in fine clothes who recounted the strange, spell-like power of Isaiah's music that night. They described their hearts racing, their breath shortening, their souls seized by an invisible hand. Every retelling made the legend larger. Even Dr. Wells, the parish physician, added to the confusion. Medically speaking, he admitted, I cannot prove malice, but I have never seen emotion manifest with such violence. The music may have triggered the master's death. That was all the jury needed to hear. The defense, a nervous young attorney named James Lawrence, stood only once. Gentlemen, he stammered, music is not murder. If it were, Beethoven himself would hang for his symphonies. His words fell flat. In this room, reason was a foreign language. Isaiah never interrupted. He didn't plead. When the judge finally asked if he wished to speak before sentencing, he rose slowly and said, I played what was true. The truth is never gentle. A collective shiver ran through the courtroom. To the enslaved men standing in the hallway, those words sounded like scripture. To the white gentry in the pews, they sounded like prophecy or a curse. The verdict was swift, guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. Date, July 2nd, 1842. Margaret Harrington collapsed in tears. Thomas clenched his fists, whispering that justice had been served. But the look in Isaiah's eyes as he was led away unsettled everyone who saw it. It wasn't fear. It was peace, the calm of a man who had already outlived his punishment. In the jailhouse, days passed without sound. Reporters came, ministers preached, and rumor filled every silence. Some said he had confessed to summoning spirits through his violin. Others claimed he laughed at the idea of dying, saying death was only another key to play in. 2 nights before the execution, Margaret arrived. She entered the cell trembling, a candle in her hand. Isaiah, she whispered, tell me, did you mean to kill him? He looked at her with tired eyes. No, ma'am. I meant to free him. Her breath caught. Free him? From what? From the lie he lived in. I only played what was inside him already. She began to cry, not for her husband, but for the truth she had never dared to face. The next morning, a petition reached the governor's desk, Margaret's own plea for mercy. Against all expectation, it worked. The execution was halted hours before dawn. Isaiah's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. When the guards told him, he simply asked, May I have my violin? They refused. And so he walked out of the courthouse in chains, not to freedom, but to silence, leaving behind a legend that would only grow louder with every retelling. Because sometimes, the most terrifying music is the one that keeps playing long after the strings are cut. The walls of the Louisiana State Penitentiary were built from stone and silence. Inside them, Isaiah Miller lived out the years that followed, a man whose only crime was telling the truth through sound. His violin was gone, his hand scarred, but in the long nights, the music never left him. It hummed in his chest like a heartbeat he couldn't quiet. He made shoes for the prison workshop, bent over rough leather that tore at his palms. To the guards, he was just another convict. But among the inmates, whispers spread, the man who killed with music. Some feared him, others revered him. And still, he never spoke. Back at Willow Creek, Margaret Harrington lived in another kind of prison. The grand mansion that once hosted laughter and music now echoed with ghosts. Her husband's death had stripped away not only her wealth but her illusions. She'd played the dutiful widow, but at night, she sat in the music room alone, staring at Isaiah's empty chair. She had visited him only once, before his transfer to Baton Rouge. He had told her a single sentence that would haunt her forever. The death was in him long before I drew my bow. Those words dug deeper than any lash could. They forced her to see the truth she'd hidden for years, that Jonathan's cruelty had eaten through him like rot long before that final performance. And perhaps she had asked Isaiah to summon something she didn't understand. In her grief, Margaret turned inward. She stopped entertaining guests, stopped attending church. She wrote constantly, diary entries, letters, fragments of thought that no one would see until long after she was gone. 10 years passed. In February 1852, tuberculosis claimed her life. When her belongings were sorted, Servants found a sealed letter among her papers, addressed to the governor of Louisiana. The instructions were clear, to be delivered upon her death. When the envelope reached Governor Joseph Walker, its contents stunned him. Margaret's confession was simple, written in an unsteady but honest hand. My husband, Jonathan Harrington, suffered from a weak heart, a condition known only to our family physician. He forbade me from revealing it, fearing it would make him appear less of a man. I must also confess that it was I who asked Isaiah to compose something new for our anniversary, a piece from his soul. I believed it would move Jonathan to compassion. I did not foresee what truth his music might reveal. She ended the letter with one final plea. I cannot die knowing this man suffers for what my own pride began. He played no murder. He played a mirror. The governor ordered an immediate review. Within weeks, Isaiah's name was read again in the Baton Rouge courthouse. The verdict that once damned him was quietly reversed. After 10 years in silence, Isaiah Miller was pardoned. When the guards came to tell him, he didn't speak at first. He simply stared at his hands, flexing them slowly as though testing whether freedom still fit inside them. He left the prison with nothing, no possessions, no instrument, not even a record of where to go. But that night, as he walked toward the city lights of New Orleans, he hummed softly, a melody no one had ever heard. It carried the weight of chains, the grace of forgiveness, and the faintest whisper of hope. Some say a carriage driver swore he saw him stop on the bridge outside Baton Rouge, turn toward the dark water, and raise his hands as though conducting an unseen orchestra. Others said he was just praying. But those who truly knew Isaiah believed otherwise. He wasn't praying. He was listening, to the sound of a ghost leaving his heart, and a song returning home. Freedom, when it finally came, did not announce itself with trumpets. It came quietly, in the soft shuffle of Isaiah Miller's feet leaving the prison gates, in the cool Louisiana air brushing against skin that had forgotten what liberty felt like. 10 years of silence had dulled his voice, but not his soul. The guards handed him a slip of paper marked, "Pardoned," and that was all. No fanfare. No apology. Just a man walking away from the place that had tried to bury his music. He followed the river south, toward New Orleans, the one city where sound still had power. Its streets pulsed with rhythm, church bells, street vendors, steamboats, laughter. It was chaos, but it was alive. There, amid the noise, Isaiah began to find pieces of himself again. He took odd jobs first, repairing shoes, tuning instruments for street performers. One evening, he passed a group of free black musicians playing outside a cafe in the French Quarter. Their violins and drums wove melodies both mournful and joyous, unlike anything he'd heard before. It was music that spoke. When they noticed the quiet man lingering nearby, one of them offered him a violin. Isaiah hesitated. His hand still bore the scars, the fingers stiff from old wounds, but when he lifted the bow, the city itself seemed to pause. The first note was rough. The second found its balance. By the third, the sound was alive again. The men around him exchanged looks. "Old man," one said softly, "you play like you've been waiting a long time." Isaiah smiled faintly. "A lifetime." In the months that followed, word spread through the quarter of an aging violinist who played like a preacher at confession, his music weeping one moment, rejoicing the next. He played in churches, in taverns, in alleys lit by oil lamps. His sound was something new, part classical, part African rhythm, part sorrow, part salvation. Some nights, children gathered just to watch him play. Other nights, sailors threw coins and whispered that they could feel his stories in their bones. When asked about his compositions, Isaiah never spoke of Willow Creek. He simply said, "Every man carries his own song. Mine just took longer to find its way out." It was around this time that a young journalist named Edward Harrison found him. Harrison had heard whispers of the musician who once killed a man with his violin. He expected madness. Instead, he found a calm, soft-spoken man with eyes that carried both peace and thunder. "Did you really kill your master with music?" Harrison asked. Isaiah chuckled. "Music can't kill, son. It only reveals what's already dying." That line would stay with Harrison for years. He wrote about Isaiah's story, though much of it was dismissed as local folklore. But those who heard Isaiah play knew better. They heard rebellion disguised as melody. By the time the Civil War ended, Isaiah was an old man. Yet his music lived on through others, through the children he taught in makeshift schools for freedmen, through the young musicians who watched his hands and copied his phrasing. What he gave them wasn't just technique. It was truth. He taught them that music could speak what mouths dared not say. And in that truth lay the seed of something greater, something that would one day grow into jazz, into blues, into every song born of struggle and soul. Isaiah Miller never saw the future he helped shape. He died quietly in New Orleans, some said in 1870, others in 1873. No grave marks his name. But his melody, that strange, trembling blend of sorrow and defiance, never died. It became part of the city's rhythm, passed from one generation to the next, whispered in trumpet notes, carried in gospel choirs, echoed in the midnight hum of Bourbon Street. Freedom had finally found its sound. Time has a way of turning truth into legend, and legend into something even more powerful. Long after Isaiah Miller's final note faded into the humid New Orleans night, his story refused to die. It passed from one mouth to another, growing, changing, becoming myth. The man who played his master's death march. The musician who freed himself through sound. The violinist who turned suffering into symphony. At first, the story was whispered, in the backrooms of taverns, in the songs of freedmen, in the trembling voices of those who had seen too much and lived to tell it. Then it traveled north with soldiers and journalists, spreading like a haunting refrain. By the late 1800s, old folks in St. James Parish told it like scripture. They said the devil himself had guided Isaiah's bow that night. Others insisted it was no devil at all, just the truth made unbearable. One elderly man, a former stable boy, was once quoted as saying, "It wasn't witchcraft. It was honesty. Mr. Harrington just couldn't live with it." In that single line lay the entire weight of the story. Because Isaiah's music had never been about vengeance or violence. It was about exposure, stripping away the illusions of power and civility that masked a world built on cruelty. His violin spoke the words he could not say, that even within chains, there is a kind of freedom that no master can touch, the freedom to feel, to create, to reveal. Decades later, historians searching through parish records rediscovered the trial transcripts, the newspaper clippings, and Margaret Harrington's confession. Scholars argued about what really happened that night in 1842. Was it murder, coincidence, or something no science could name? But among musicians, there was no debate. They knew what Isaiah had done, not just that he'd killed a man, but that he had proven art itself could be rebellion. His influence ran deep. Those who learned from him carried fragments of his style, the sliding notes, the broken rhythms, the feeling that every song was both prayer and protest. Some say the first jazz players of New Orleans, decades later, were echoing Isaiah without even knowing his name. In 1948, a music historian called him a missing link between plantation spirituals and the dawn of jazz. But to those who still whispered his name, Isaiah was more than that. He was a reminder that beauty can be dangerous, and that truth, once spoken, never goes silent again. And what of Willow Creek? The grand plantation house burned during the Civil War, its ruins left to rot beneath the vines. Today, the earth has reclaimed it, only foundations remain, half buried under moss and memory. Yet locals still say that on still summer nights, when the wind moves through the cypress trees, you can hear something faint, a thread of melody drifting through the air, like a violin played by someone who refuses to be forgotten. Perhaps it's just the wind. Or perhaps it's the echo of the night when music became resistance, when a man turned his suffering into a song that outlived his masters, his chains, and even his name. Because that is Isaiah Miller's true legacy. Not the death he may have caused, but the life he reclaimed through art. His story reminds us that even in the darkest places, creation can be defiance, and expression can be freedom. They chained his body. They silenced his bow. But his music, it never stopped playing. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, beneath the Louisiana moon, it still plays on.